Climate action and politics. Everything we've discussed for the last 2 days is inordinately important. We heard about the great work that's being done on so many fronts by so many companies and so many organizations, and yet so much of what really needs to happen to accomplish the long-term goals we're all concerned about and working for only gets done if the political framework, if the political will matches the will of the private sector. Todd Stern, joining us, U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change until very recently, led our negotiations in Paris, now a visiting professor at Yale. We're going to see what he's going to do next. But
why don't you find out, tell me.
Why don't we put Paris in context? Everyone is happy that it got done. It was a signature agreement for a number of reasons. But there's a lot of skepticism, frankly, even in the private sector, that these goals are really going to be met, domestically and internationally. It's going to be tough. At this early stage, what, as you see it, is the meaning and importance of Paris, even though we're not quite there yet?
Well, thanks a lot, David, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for to BSR for the invitation. Look, Paris was a historic agreement. It's an unprecedented agreement. It is the first universal climate agreement that really sets the framework for the global climate regime. It is ambitious in a whole number of ways. There were something like, at this point, about 190 countries put forward their initial targets. There are embedded very strong goals for the short and medium and long term. And also, really importantly, cycles built in on an every 5-year basis where there's global stock take of how we're doing in the aggregate and review of country targets to ratchet those up. There's transparency built in. There is a form of differentiating which is not based on the old firewall between developed and developing countries, but is based much more on capacity of countries. There's strong provisions on financial assistance and so forth. So all of this is really important, and it sets, I mean, what it does really is to give us a chance. You can't deal with this problem if you don't have a global framework, because it's a classic quintessentially global problem, and you're not going to get countries move if they don't see that their competitors and their partners are also moving. So that piece is largely done. And the name of the game now is really to drive the transition to low carbon.
Terrific. So unprecedented, historic. We have more than 190 countries on board. But Lisa, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to achieving this? And think about the private sector here. I mean, we're here at BSR.
Well, first of all, thank you again also so much for having me here. I guess I'd say that as far as we've been covering it, there's two big challenges, domestic and international. Domestically, will the United States meet its targets? Probably. But there's a lot that remains to be seen as to whether the Clean Power Plan, the U.S. effort to reduce emissions from the power sector, lives, and how we get further than those targets. On the global scale, every year the United Nations Environment Program comes out with what they call the gap report. It's the distance between what countries have promised to do and what needs to be done to stay below the 2-degree threshold. We're still pretty far away. Ed's going to tell you that we're closer than we were, and that's certainly true. But the UN. UNEP right now is saying the targets, that even if all of these countries meet their targets, we're still looking at 3 degrees. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a little less, maybe it's a little more. But when it comes time for countries to ratchet up these targets, to put more on the table, will they? Will they do enough to get us there? Yeah.
Edward Cameron, Managing Director for Climate at BSR, previously worked on climate issues for the World Resources Institute, the World Bank, the government of the Maldives, and the EU. It's easy for businesses to hear all this, the threat of looming more regulation and everything that's happening in Paris. And of course, business was central to what was happening in Paris, and lots of business leaders were represented there. And yet, when I speak with business leaders in my work at the Times, there's still a sense among some that all of this may be punitive somehow, that it's going to require sacrifice first, and then maybe at the end of the tunnel, perhaps there's opportunity. How do you see it? And when you're talking with businesses, do you pitch it as, listen, and there's going to be some pain in the short term? Or are you saying actually there's a near-term opportunity, that this might actually be good for business somehow?
So I think part of the reason why Paris is considered successful and why we're now seeing enormous momentum on climate more broadly is because we have managed to shift the conversation amongst governments and amongst the private sector from what used to be a discussion about burden sharing to a discussion about the opportunity of a low carbon economy. Paris, I think, is really successful because of the scale of ambition. We have deviated the global mean temperature rises from 4.8 degrees Celsius to closer to 3 degrees Celsius. There's another way of looking at that. We have opened up $13.5 trillion of investment opportunities in clean energy alone because of all of the national climate action plans that Todd mentioned. We've opened up similar orders of magnitude for investments in transportation, in land use, in urbanization, in industrial development. So if you're a financial services company right now, you have the opportunity of looking at a totally different global economic system over the course of the coming decades and to assess how you might engage with that new system. I would also say that, at least in my conversations with the private sector, the threat of regulation is one forcing mechanism that makes a company think about how it might act on climate. But there are many other motivations, there are many other facets of the business case. There's the fact that business increasingly understands the risk of climate impacts and understands that inaction is itself a choice. There's the growing shareholder and other stakeholder activism that is making businesses think seriously about this issue. There's the fact that action on climate change is becoming more cost competitive. There's the fact that as we move into a different world, we have human resources in terms of worker recruitment and retention issues to think about because millennials want to work for purpose-driven companies. So there are all manner of reasons why I think the private sector is beginning to look at this as an opportunity. I would also say, just as a final point, that I've worked on climate for over 20 years. And for those who are critical of the Paris Agreement, I would equate it to somebody who wins $10 million in the lottery and then complains they didn't win 13 million. Because where we are today as a consequence of what happened in Paris is beyond the wildest imagination of most of us who worked in the climate community. And the signature moment at Paris was when Secretary of State Kerry embraced his Chinese counterpart at the end, right before the gavel came down. Because as Todd will recall, a number of years in Copenhagen, they were shouting at each other across the table, pointing fingers at each other, and chasing each other to and from the airport. And to get to a point where we now have the Chinese and the Americans holding hands on this issue, setting up the architecture of the agreement, working behind the scenes to shape the outcome, bringing other countries along with them, committing to this. The fact that you have 196 countries that can't even agree on what date it is today, agreeing that they will move forward on this together, that to me is something to celebrate, not something to criticize.
I like that optimistic vision. Todd, I want to return though to how the US actually implements this and meets its own goals to start with. Even the Obama administration has acknowledged that the Clean Power Plan alone, it just probably won't be enough. It's talked about methane reductions, it's talked about efficiencies, but aren't we ultimately looking at stricter regulations of emissions from paper factories, from refineries, from all manner of industries here? And is that not going to be something that the next administration, and we'll get to Tuesday soon enough, is it not something that the next administration is going to have to take very seriously, whether there's just a broader suite of industry-specific regulations that we're going to have to see?
Well, look, there's no question that the next administration is going to have to take it very seriously, and I have a great deal of confidence that one of the two options on next Tuesday will do that. The President Obama and his administration, I think, really did extraordinary work on the domestic side, also on the international side, but on the domestic side, more broadly than on Clean Power Plan. The vehicle standards that went from 27 to 54 miles per gallon was a huge step. There's all sorts of energy efficiency standards that regulate the efficiency of all sorts of the appliances and systems that run buildings, and then the Clean Power Plan, and many other things. And all of this, the kind of paradigm that we're in right now is you basically need to do things that can be done on the basis of existing congressional authority, which then gets used to regulate, because new congressional authority, unfortunately, so far hasn't been viable. But tremendous amount has been done on that basis, and more will have to be done. First of all, to hit the 2025 target, but then beyond that, those targets take us a good, important part of the way. But in 2020, under Paris, the U.S. will be putting forward its 2030 target, and then still beyond that, and we have to think through to mid-century. So there will have to be big changes in the economy. So there's no question that that's true. But I'll just give you one number to think about from a Citigroup report called Energy Darwinism Part 2 that I read recently. And they project over a period of about 25 years a cost of infrastructure development for the energy system of the country in a scenario where we don't act on climate at all, and in a scenario where we do. And the scenario where we do act on climate is slightly cheaper. And it's slightly cheaper because it includes not just the capital expenditure, but also fuel. And because the costs of these things, the cost of solar and wind and others coming down so dramatically quickly that you have that impact, and that doesn't even count the massive savings the massive avoidance of climate damage that would ensue if you follow the inaction scenario. So is it going to cost? Yeah, in a way, but it's going to cost a lot more if we don't. And are there opportunities for companies? Hugely. I mean, are there some companies that are going to have more challenges? Yes. And I mean, I think for companies, basically, this is an issue where you've got to assess risk, and there's a lot of different kinds of risk, whether it's physical risk, supply chain risk, market risk, regulatory risk, reputational risk. There's risks to manage, but there's also a great deal of opportunity. If you do it right, you've got to plan through and analyze your own systems to see how to manage the risks that you've got, and also depending on what part of the business scene you're in, really big opportunities.
Okay. The tone is determined optimism. I think everyone's trying to stay the course.
Well, yeah, this is a huge challenge to get to go back to, to get to the 2-degree goals. I think can I say one other thing?
Please.
So, first of all, to get to the 2 degree is or less than 2 degrees is the goal. To hold temperature to an increase of less than 2 degrees is one of the goals in Paris. Essentially, to get to a net zero carbon world in the second half of this century is another one of the goals. Those are massively challenging goals, and I don't gainsay that at all. What I would say is that from the point of view of our innovation capacity, of policy, and of our capacity to finance, indeed, as I just said a little bit ago, it's going to end up being cheaper in the long run. We can do all those things. The ingredient that is absolutely critical is the politics and the political will. And I worked in the little bit on the margins of the Clinton campaign back in '92, and the little sign in the war room was, "It's the economy, stupid." On this issue, it's kind of the politics, stupid. I mean, we've got to get the politics right on this, and that's going to be a big challenge. Okay,
Lisa, from where you sit, and I may have neglected to introduce Lisa, editor of ClimateWire, so you've been watching these issues for a long time. President Obama has obviously made this a central part of his legacy, he hopes, of his foreign policy. Do you sense, from where you sit in Washington, covering these issues so carefully, that the Clinton campaign, assuming Secretary Clinton is elected on Tuesday, has the intention to make climate a similarly central part of her platform?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the big stories that we're looking at, right? And for those of you here who are not familiar, and probably most of you, ClimateWire and E&E News covers energy and environment issues really closely. And so all of these issues that Todd and Ed talked about, we write about this stuff in depth. And one of the things, there's 2 areas of big stories that we're looking at. One, of course, is if Donald Trump is elected, how does one cancel the Paris Agreement? And what does it mean if the United States, if the Trump administration either pulls out at a time when it can, or simply says the US isn't going to meet its targets. The other story that we're looking at, if the aggregate of the polls hold up, is, well, what is it that Hillary Clinton will do as president? What will a Clinton administration do? Where are the next emission cuts going to come from? Will we see a price on carbon? I think that's a really open question, and maybe one of you can speak to it better. But we know that she has been very careful about avoiding talking about it. It's something that Bernie Sanders talked about all the time. I think there's a real political awareness about how touchy a subject that is in the campaign. And frankly, we don't know what we're going to see in an administration. I will say she has been speaking about climate change from the beginning. I mean, most of what we're seeing right now is about the politics, right? It's a lot easier, I think, to campaign probably on maybe dinging Republicans on being climate skeptics. That gets a lot of millennials, revved up, and using climate change, I think, is one of the issues that her campaign has felt speaks to millennials. We're not seeing too much substance yet beyond putting a vast number of solar panels on houses and discussion of the need to boost R&D. That said, I cannot see that this would not be a major issue in a Clinton administration. We have Todd Stern here, who was appointed by Hillary Clinton. One would think that there would be a lot of whispers in her ear about how to continue what the United States has done in the Obama administration.
Yeah.
Can I just make a point here, because I think there's a danger that we sit and we think that politics is something we have to accept, as opposed to politics is something that we shape. And one of the great successes of the Paris Agreement is not that business has now absorbed the agreement and is implementing it, it's that business was there shaping the agreement and turning it from what would have been a diplomatic settlement amongst nations into a catalytic instrument for the real market. And similarly, I have been asked over many, many years, as someone living in the United States but who is not American, by people from all over the world, what is going on in US politics and why aren't the Republicans on board with this issue?
Edward, what is going on in US politics?
I'm about to reveal the answer. I used to answer that question by saying, it's not about ideology, it's about geology. So you would have Democrats in the Rust Belt, and I can think of one in particular who ran a campaign a few years ago where his campaign ad was shooting a gun at the cap and trade deal. He was demonstrating his bona fides on both guns and climate. But it used to be about geology, not ideology. And if you think of some of the signature things that have happened on environment in the United States, it was a Republican president who established the national park system. It was a Republican president who established the EPA. It was the first President Bush who signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I can no longer answer with integrity the question the way I used to answer it. It is no longer a bipartisan issue. It has become a tribal issue. But that doesn't mean that that has to hold solid permanently. So I think one of the challenges that we face over the coming years is not how do we put in more laws, it's how do we make this a bipartisan issue again? How do we make this less of a tribal issue again? And I can tell you for a fact that many of the companies that are leading on this issue are not led by Democrats, are not led by Hillary Clinton supporters, but they are people who are responding to either a need that they feel is intrinsic to the success of their company, or for other reasons they're beginning to act on this issue. But I really think it's incumbent upon us to try and find a way of making this once again a bipartisan issue, because otherwise we will never get to the point where there is an act of Congress. We will never get to the point where this is truly a universal endeavor that we're all bought into.
Todd, yeah, please. And in some of my recent reporting, I've talked to Republicans, including Republicans in the House and Senate, who, off the record, will acknowledge that man-made climate change is going on, and these are big issues.
Right.
But on the record, in the ears of their constituents, they won't approach the issue. What is going on, and is there any movement? I mean, this is the real question. Is there any chance that this is going to once again become a bipartisan issue, as you see it, in the next 4 or 8 years, Todd?
Well, so I think that there's actually a fair amount of movement. I would distinguish the public from the Hill for the time being. And I'll come back to that. But I think that there's a fair amount of movement in the public. If you look at polling with respect to Paris, with respect to the Clean Power Plan, with respect to climate change is happening, it's not happening, all of that stuff is moving in quite a good direction. I remember there was a poll that was taken in proximity to Paris, where a very large percentage of people, including about half of Republicans, were for an international deal. And so I think, and I also think that's moving in the right direction generationally. I mean, young people get this more than their elders, and so I think that there's forward motion, and unfortunately, the signals that we get from nature just are going to continue to grow and get worse. So that will have a positive effect. On the other hand, remember, there's probably 80% of Americans in favor of some form of responsible gun control, and you can't move anything through Congress. So the fact that you have, it's certainly a probably necessary but not sufficient condition to have that greater activism and support in the public. Look, I think that the business community is actually hugely important here. There is no question that there are any number of members of Congress, certainly any number of Republican senators who certainly recognize that this is a real issue. I've talked with some number of them, but it still has a third rail kind of feel up on the Hill. And I think that there is a distinction with respect to business between being kind of for taking action, acting within, am I still? I'm
You're
on,
fine.
right? Acting within their own companies, speaking, even businesses coming to, meetings with President Obama in the White House and things like that, and finding their public voice at the CEO level. Not just at the level of people in this room, but at the CEO level, in direct conversations with members of Congress and publicly. And that, obviously, I'm not saying anything unusual to say that business is a very important constituency for members on both sides of the aisle, but very, very much including Republican members. And that's going to be that's progress. We got to make progress on that front, because I have always been convinced that if we had a big room like this and 500, the CEOs of the Fortune 500, you would have over 90% who said, of course, climate change is real, because if you are a CEO, you are a fact-based person, or else you wouldn't be a CEO. And if you're a fact-based person, you don't fool around with silly ideology, and you realize we've got a problem.
Yeah. Lisa, you're on the Hill, you're talking to the CEOs, you're talking to the politicians. What in your estimation, is the one or two issues where we might look for these early glimmers of bipartisan cooperation? I mean, I imagine a carbon tax probably isn't at the top of the list, but where are the areas where there could be real work together? Yeah,
not to be the skunk at the garden party, although that's usually the reporter's role. I think... I think the areas of cooperation are going to be hard to say. Let me just flip that a minute and talk about where some of the challenges are. In the Senate, if the Senate remains Republican, I think we are still going to see both occasional attacks on the Paris Agreement. I think you're going to see some questions by Senators Inhofe and Barrasso and others who have long questioned the science of climate change. Is that what happens when you say Inhofe here? Even looking at what they can do to throw some rocks under the bus of the Montreal Protocol, which was another large, very key agreement, amendment to an agreement that was sealed last month to ratchet down, to phase out hydrofluorocarbons. I can't believe I pronounced that correctly, HFCs. This is something that not just all countries agreed to, but industry is heavily in favor of, and yet you're seeing not a few Republicans saying, whoa, we're not sure if we're going to, I don't know if that's something that needs to be ratified. That's something that the Senate will decide. In the House isn't going anywhere. The House, you've got this, they call it the Gibson 13, the 13 Republicans, 13 of 435 who are overtly active on climate change, who aren't just saying quietly, that the science is real. And so I think you have an enormous challenge on the Hill. Where I see some of the interesting progress actually is in the states. You have this massive challenge with the Clean Power Plan, and yet many, I'm reluctant to say most because I'm not remembering my numbers all offhand, but many states are going to meet, if not, are going to meet their targets. Many states that are fighting the Clean Power Plan in the courts are quietly working on plans at home. Outside of the Clean Power Plan, you have, as both Todd and Ed have spoken to, a driving down of costs of renewables and other things happening in the marketplace. As wind power increases in Oklahoma, are we going to see politics there change? For example, I don't want to say a name again because who knows what's going to happen with that beep, but I think the states and the work that utilities are doing around the country is where some of the most positive changes are happening while the Hill remains tense.
Right. Edward, HFCs isn't the buzzword that's going to ignite the passions of millennials necessarily. And of course, we didn't see one question about climate in any of the presidential or vice presidential debates. It was a huge disappointment. Where are we on just the simple baseline raising awareness of this issue? And do things like Years of Living Dangerously and kind of popular culture, do these move the needle at all? Or what is actually needed to thrust this, as you see it, more fulsomely onto the national agenda?
Well, I'm delighted you think I look like a millennial.
I didn't say that.
I'm the spokesperson for millennials. If we could make one change, if I could dream up one intervention on climate change, I would love the Kardashian family to be speaking about this issue regularly so that we could shift our culture. That's what we need. We need the Kardashian family.
Can I give you a little bit of trivia? The week of COP22 in Paris, every single day, the second week, there was a story about the Kardashians that was better read than every story about the COP. There was a study.
So, if we can't get the Kardashians, I would say that there's still a lesson to be learned. One of the things that I believe strongly about this issue is that we cannot assume that what got us excited about this issue or motivated is what gets other people excited or motivated about this issue. So one of my earlier jobs was to work for the government of the Maldives, and I represented the Maldives in Washington and had the wonderful job of having to go to Capitol Hill all the time and persuade people to take A, climate change, and B, a small island developing state seriously. And I would find that when I would go to the Hill and speak about ecology, a certain small number of doors would open and the rest would slam shut. But when I created what I called a vocabulary of arguments, and I went back and started speaking about the link between climate and human rights, or the link between climate and faith, stewardship of the land, or issues of competitiveness, or issues of national security, which is what got Senator McCain and Senator Warner initially interested in these issues. By expanding that vocabulary of arguments, we were able to draw more people into this conversation, and as a consequence, we were able to generate far more action. So I think one of the things we've got to do as we move forward is identify what is the point of nexus between climate change and so many other issues, and capitalize on that to begin changing the nature of how people understand climate risk, but also begin changing the nature of how people understand an on-ramp to climate action. Because we hear all the time at BSR from companies who say, we can't take environment to the board. The board just simply doesn't care about environment, but they really do care about women, because women constitute the bulk of our workforce, they constitute the bulk of our buyers. Or we care about human rights because there happens to be a legacy of care for that particular issue within the DNA of our company. Using that vocabulary of arguments is important as a narrative to get them to act, but it's also an important diagnostic tool, because if you're a company that works on financial services and you're not ready to build financial vehicles for investment in renewable energy, you might be ready to build out your portfolio to give access to financial services to vulnerable and marginalized communities, to low-income people, to people of color, to women. That is a contribution towards climate action. That is a contribution to climate resilience. because many of these people suffer fatalities and other impacts because they don't have access to financial goods and services. So there are many ways in which we can actually get people acting on this issue simply by changing the way we talk about it and giving people an on-ramp to the issue that we haven't done before, because this has historically been dominated by natural scientists who only know how to speak to each other, or frankly, too often dominated by people who are social democrat or center-left, and as a consequence don't really know how to bring the other side into the argument and into the conversation. So I think that's a key thing to do, and I think, as Todd has mentioned, the capacity to do that with millennials and with the next generation, I think, is going to be increasing, perhaps because they're not as stuck in their ways and stuck in their own arguments as perhaps some people of my age are.
Todd, in your dialogue with folks around this administration, previous administrations, is that awareness growing? I mean, when you talk to people in defense, are they saying, yes, climate's on our agenda in a very serious way? And is that helping move, the levers of power in other departments in Washington, even if Congress maybe isn't all the way there yet?
Yeah, I think definitely yes. When the president announced his climate action plan in the Georgetown speech in 2013, and then brought John Podesta, who had been Bill Clinton's chief of staff, in to run it. I think there was a real impact within the administration, and I think also in terms of communication, because there was a clear focus both on implementing a whole set of policies, but also on creating a steady drumbeat of presidential events and other kinds of activities to get this in the news. And I mean, does it explode the thing from the bottom to the top of the list? No, but I think definitely it was definitely useful, and that kind of thing I think has to be part of, should be part of any kind of calculation and any kind of plan going forward. In terms of within the administration, I mean, if you look at the quadrennial QDR, the every 4-year report that the Pentagon does, the last one was 2014. Very powerful stuff in there on climate, and also from the intelligence community. The head of Pacific Command, Admiral Locklear, former head of the Pacific Command from a few years ago, gave an interview in which he said that in his view, the issue that created the greatest possible risk of major security destabilization in his whole region is climate change. So I think it doesn't mean this affects everybody. Everybody agrees with this, but I think you have a lot more of that kind of thing, and it needs, in my judgment, for it to work in an administration, it needs to get driven out of the White House.
Terrific. I want to circle back with one more question on carbon tax, which we kind of danced around. But first, I want to just let the audience know that we'll be turning to questions in just a few minutes. There will be mics going around, and you can also ask questions on Twitter using the conference hashtag. Yeah, please.
Just to add one thing about when you think about where things are happening, it's also where some of the best stories are, right? And so going back to what businesses are doing in the States, I mean, as I listen to the both of you, it's not just on the mitigation end that things are happening. It's in the States, it's in adaptation too. And, Ed and I were talking, I mean, I used to write about climate change impacts in Bangladesh and Haiti and, all over the world. And increasingly, we are writing about climate change impacts right here at home, in North Carolina, in New Jersey, in Florida, up and down the coast, and also in places where you wouldn't think about it, like North Dakota, in Cedar Rapids, Idaho. And so when we talk about, is this making traction when it comes to issues like defense, what is notable to me is that after covering this issue since about 2008 and talking to folks like former Senator Warner and others and military leaders about the threat that climate change poses and covering the QDR, the Republican chairman of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees continue to think that this is bunk. But the folks at Norfolk Naval Base, on the other hand, they are preparing. They're preparing for sea level rise. They are protecting their base. And I mean, I don't want to say bunk, but that's how they treat it, right? That's the response that I get when I go to the House and Senate leaders to ask about, what the Pentagon is saying about climate change. They're fighting that very hard. But that is not what's happening on the ground. And in the States, it's a very different story.
Yeah. I want to just briefly return to the mechanics of actually meeting our goals, and we'd be remiss if we didn't spend just a bit more time on a carbon tax. Todd, in your estimation, you've studied the data as closely as anyone on actually how we set these goals and how we try to achieve them. Is a carbon tax necessary to achieve these goals in the long term, our short-term goals, our medium-term goals? And if it is it politically feasible? Is it something that you actually think might get pulled off in this kind of partisan culture we live in today?
Yeah, David, I don't know if it's necessary. I mean, there's all sorts of tools. I mean, I think most economists would say it's smart, right? I mean, it's that you can do what you need to do overall at a lower cost than if you have than if you proceed by way of fixed standards and caps and things like that. My guess is that if you had the political capacity to do it, you would have a quite full menu, which could include aspects of that and much of what's being done now. So President Obama tried to put a price on carbon. It's not that there is any kind of hesitation about this within his administration. There's two ways to get a price on carbon: a carbon tax or cap and trade regime, and obviously the president tried to do a cap and trade, get a cap and trade bill done, the Waxman-Markey bill, in the first 2 years of the administration. It got halfway home, but not all the way home. So it's an absolutely very viable policy tool. If you can't get it done, there's other ways to do it. I think that I go back to what I said a little while ago, that changing the politics is going to be ultimately critical to this.
Yeah.
I think there's also an assumption that carbon tax and carbon pricing are the same things. And sometimes there's an assumption that this isn't happening. There's more than 60 illustrations at different jurisdictions around the world already of carbon pricing. If you look at China, they have 7 pilot emissions trading systems that are being blended into one national emissions trading system that's establishing a carbon price. And if you look at the national climate action plans that came out of Paris, many of them create the roadmap to setting up national carbon pricing systems as well. The key issue is, how do you design them? They're designed in multiple different ways. And I think that the key is going to be designing them appropriately and then getting them to speak to each other, getting them to be connected to each other, because there doesn't seem to be an appetite for one uniform global carbon pricing system. But for people to come out of the conversation in Paris and say, we didn't achieve a carbon price, well, there's language in the Paris Agreement that speaks and provides a hook for that, and there are many examples within national climate action plans of carbon pricing. And
it's worth noting that some businesses, in fact, are imposing carbon taxes on themselves. I don't want to give any one company too much credit, but I wrote about Microsoft, and I think it was one of the first things we said on this panel. The threat or the expectation of regulation is prompting some businesses to act, and this was the case here. They figure that somewhere down the line a carbon tax or a price on carbon is coming, so they went ahead and designed their own, and they're using the money, they're actually taxing their business units, and they're using the cash that they draw from those business units to fund sustainability projects around the company. It's pretty innovative. All right, we're going to turn to questions. We have a few minutes. I have the first one from Twitter, and then we'll go to the audience. Why don't we send a microphone your way? Susan Papp asks, why weren't women's rights and their roles better reflected in the discourse at COP21, and how can we change this? I think that's for you, Todd.
Well, I don't have the agreement right in front of me now, but I know that there were any number of places in the agreement where women's rights, gender issues were highlighted as something important. There's different ways to do that, and I'm sure that there were some people who were hoping it would have a different placement than it ended up having. There's always lots of considerations about how those kinds of things land. I mean, we were quite supportive of and have been for years. I should say my wife was a deputy in the Global Women's Issues Office for Hillary Clinton, so I live this at home as well. But there are there are always a whole lot of issues that various countries have that they're trying to press, and that some balancing ends up getting done. I can't recall exactly what the placement is, but I know that we worked quite hard to get.
Let me ask Lisa about the second part of this. How do we make it more central to this conversation?
Well, I can't speak to that, but just to give a little flavor of what a COP is like, thousands of people, most of them lawyers, fighting about texts and commas and words, over hundreds and thousands of pages. I don't remember, I wasn't following issues of women and gender specifically, but just to give an example of one fight among, hundreds or thousands those 2 weeks was over language on, injecting language on human rights, right? Where there was a group that wanted to get language linking climate protection from climate change to human rights. To my recollection, and we wrote about this, but Saudi Arabia was very concerned about that language and tried to inject some other language that would have been uncomfortable for Israel, that caused other countries to come in and say, no, let's just not deal with this whole human rights issue at all. And I think what wound up happening was language that was a little watered down. Stuff like that happens on every paragraph of every page of this agreement. And so, to ask why one element didn't get into a text, it could be something like that.
But can we make sure that we don't leave the impression that human rights is not addressed in the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, please.
No, it is.
I don't think we said that. I don't think we said that.
It wasn't as strong, right?
The first thing is that a number of years ago...
I think in particular it was women's rights in this case.
Yeah, but a number of years ago at the COP that was held in Davos, I can't remember what number COP that was, there was a specific provision put into a COP decision to move towards gender balance and diversity within national delegations, which is very important because if a woman is on a national delegation, she can speak to the specific vulnerability of women, she can speak to women as agents of change, and she can begin to shape policy, including treaty language, in a direction that is conducive for women's rights. And that happened a number of years ago, and it's similarly captured in the Paris Agreement. On top of that, it's important to bear in mind that in a 4°C world, when food security begins to break down, that undermines women's rights. And the minute you deviate from 4 degrees and you move us more towards 2.7 degrees, that is preventing women's rights from being undermined, as well as the right to life, the right to adequate standard of living, minimum means of subsistence, and all manner of other rights. So I think it is very important that we think of the Paris Agreement not as an environmental agreement, but it is also an agreement that looks to protect human rights as an outcome, and not only important in having human rights in as an input.
And that's the key answer to that question too, right? I mean, the more that, groups have been very successful about highlighting the role of women and the challenges that women will face, in a warming world. And the more that groups are successful at making this about people, men and women, that's how you're going to get these issues of gender equity into these agreements, I think.
Very good. Our first question from the audience.
Yeah, Nina Gardner, I'm a corporate sustainability consultant. I wanted to talk about maybe the elephant in the room, which is dark money, right? Why are we not getting things, Congress, to move on this? And it's because of the money that is being put into the campaigns of so many of these congressional campaigns and senatorial campaigns. Senator Whitehouse said it himself at the US SIF meeting a few months ago, saying, companies say one thing publicly and never bring up climate change to me specifically, and indeed talk about hyper-transparency that's not occurring. There is a lot of money being channeled into these races, which is why, even though you've got the Defense Department that's aligned, you even have the Green Tea Party movement. If you haven't heard of that, that's an interesting one. And you also have some companies that are trying to do the right thing. So I'm wondering, let's be bold. I hope all the people who work for American companies really make a commitment to trying to lobby their congresspeople on making sure that they are transparent about, and stop the money flowing. Or if not, be transparent about it. I'm just wondering, whether you can comment on that, because the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute have been undercutting our climate change policy for years.
Is anyone going to disagree?
Well, no, I'm not going to disagree at all, and I'm going to also. I mean, I think that I appreciate the comment. I think it's quite consistent with part of what I was saying earlier. That, and I think the world of Senator Whitehouse. I've talked with him a great deal about this issue, and actually about exactly that. And he says. The companies say one thing, but and might do good things, but then when it comes time to see a presence up here and to give some cover, frankly, to Republican members who might be prepared to come out and actually do something, you don't hear them. And I think he's concerned about that, and it's the same point that I was trying to make, so I agree with you.
Great. We are unfortunately almost out of time. I have a brief question I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer it very succinctly. Lisa, new year coming up, what are the big stories you're looking out for?
I mean, I think we, talked about some of them already. The biggest will know which direction we're going on Tuesday. But we're either looking at stories about the future of the Paris Agreement and international agreements, or we're not. We're either looking at the future of climate action in the U.S., or I don't want to say not, because I think one of the things that that I mentioned, one of our big stories domestically is what's happening in the states, and what businesses are doing, and what states are doing, what utilities are doing, and the action that they're taking, no matter what happens in Congress.
Okay, Edward, what's your message when you're out there talking specifically to business leaders over the next year?
The message is that the world is now changing, that we are now embarking upon a journey towards a low carbon, climate resilient world. That signal has been sent very powerfully by governments. It's also being sent very powerfully by other companies. There are now more than 1,000 corporate commitments through the We Mean Business Action Framework. That contains commitments from close to 500 companies who have $8 trillion of revenue and close to 200 investors that manage $20 trillion of assets. And over the course of the coming days, you'll see some of the largest companies in the world making more announcements on this issue, and that will have reverberations right throughout our economic system, right throughout our supply chain. And then in addition to that, I think what I would say is that the gold standard for what leadership on climate looks like is shifting rapidly. It used to be a company could be considered a leader by taking an intensity target. Now increasingly, to be considered a leader on this issue, you need a science-based target, absolute emissions reductions across your full supply chain, and I expect to see more companies embarking on that. And then from the political side of things, I would like to see the US Senate honoring its duty under the Constitution and having hearings and then approval of a Supreme Court justice.
Terrific.
Getting all the applause lines.
Todd, new administration means new jobs in Washington. What are you going to do next?
What am I going to do next? So I'm enjoying teaching at Yale, and I will supplement that with some combination, I think, of ongoing policy work and some work in the private sector. But talking to a lot of people and haven't landed on anything yet. But I'm not expecting. Any
specific roles in specific administrations you'd like to talk to us about?
I'm not talking about that right now.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panel. Enjoy your dinner.